Hello, my name is Katie Foster. I'm a Senior Associate in the Corporate Finance practice in London. I'm here today with James McCarthy, who is a corporate partner based in the Dubai office. James is going to share his insights today on the key drivers and trends in M&A activity in the consumer goods and retail sector in the Middle East. So James, what are the key drivers behind regional M&A in that sector at the moment?
Okay. Well, look, a significant proportion of M&A activity in the UAE, in the wider region, sort of over the last 12 to 24 months has been in the consumer sector. A good example maybe is Coca-Cola, who acquired 50% of Aujan Industries, which is a Saudi beverage company for just under $1 billion. And it's not just trade buyers either. We've acted for a number of private equity players who've also made very significant investments in the sector. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. I think they're quite well known. The demographics are very favourable. The region has a very young and growing population. I think the UN forecasts that the wider MENA population will increase by about 2% year on year between 2010 and 2030. And despite the global financial crisis, GDP and disposable incomes have remained high, particularly in the GCC. So there's a very sort of young and growing population with disposable income to spend. Thirdly, the governments have been very focused on diversification away from the traditional oil-based revenues, and particularly in high-end tourism and also retail. And then lastly, in some parts of the region, and I'm thinking Dubai in particular, there's a recognition that it's very much a showcase for retail and luxury brands in particular. So when you put all that together, there's a very attractive investment proposition, and that's both for inward investment from outside of the region, but also for intra-regional consolidation, which we've seen a lot of.
So that's positive. And in terms of doing those deals, what trends are you seeing in that area?
Yeah. I mean, just looking at the sort of legal regime for a second, the GCC in particular has quite a protectionist company law regime that generally requires international companies to set up partnerships or joint ventures with local players. And consequently, international companies and particularly retailers have historically either used contractual distribution arrangements, or they've entered into joint ventures with local partners, local companies who hold a majority legal interest in the company. And although there are ways of mitigating those foreign ownership restrictions, many companies have opted to go down the contractual route for the obvious reason that it's easier to unwind that if something goes wrong, or they have entered into those sort of joint ventures with local players. Or indeed they've shied away from the region entirely because that's just not a palatable option. And what we've seen a real trend of is those international companies who have gone with the contractual route, upgrading those relationships and moving into fully fledged joint ventures with their local partners. A good example of that perhaps is Tiffany, who recently entered into a joint venture with Damas, which is one of the leading regional retail, sort of jewellery retail groups. And then in addition, those companies that haven't historically had a presence in the region are increasingly looking to get a foothold, in part for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but also partly as a sort of a switch of focus away from developed lower growth markets to higher growth emerging markets. And then lastly, we've also seen a real trend of US companies in particular investing in the region. A good example of that is Abercrombie and Fitch, who have recently announced a joint venture with the Majid Al Futtaim Group, which is one of the prominent UAE groups.
But what about the Arab Spring? I mean, has that had an impact in this sector?
Yeah. I mean, look, the Arab Spring has undoubtedly had an impact. It's had a negative impact on investor enthusiasm, particularly in those countries where there's still unrest. But the fundamentals still remain very strong. One of the interesting consequences of the Arab Spring has been the resulting flow in the region, and the UAE in particular has benefited from a perception that it's very much a safe harbour, safe haven, and there's been an influx of human and financial capital, which in turn has actually driven consumer spending in that jurisdiction.
And so, James, if you're advising a client who's looking to invest in that sector and in that region, what are the key concerns that you will probably flag up to them at the outset?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the most obvious area, which I touched on earlier, is the foreign ownership restrictions. In some cases, these can be avoided by using free trade zones or special economic areas, but that's not always possible for certain types of activity, and there are other considerations that need to be taken into account. Second, the UAE and many other countries in the region have a regime for the registration of commercial agency or distribution arrangements. Registration is not always compulsory, but the consequence of registration is that the distributor benefits usually from a number of statutory protections. In particular, there's a compensation regime on termination. So it's very important to understand at the outset what regime applies, whether registration is required, and if so, what the consequences of that are. And then I think lastly, Middle East countries have not historically had a very developed or sophisticated antitrust regime, particularly in the GCC, and the picture there is changing. Saudi Arabia in particular has led the way on this. The UAE has recently introduced a competition law, which came into effect earlier this year, although hasn't been fully implemented yet. And this is obviously a very key area for anyone thinking of doing a transaction in the UAE or Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much, James.
That's good.